our topic today within the FSMA header moniker is specifically pathogen environmental monitoring, and part of the reason that asked to speak on this topic is because I've worked for more than 30 years, as many of you that I know. I'm a food microbiologist and I'm an environmental biologist, and so much of the many challenges relative to control of pathogens in the environment have been the focus of my work and a lot of us together our work, and so hence the reason why I was asked, and I'm honored and delighted. So today what we would like to go over is just a very brief overview of the FSMA preventive controls relative to the new requirement for environmental pathogen monitoring. We're going to talk about how to comply, some details on where to swab, some of the pitfalls when we're testing food contact surfaces, and some of the strategies for responding to findings, which in an arena where we've not had to do mandatory pathogen environmental monitoring, these are all important and I'm sure relevant questions on everybody's mind. And so as part of the new FSMA preventive controls for food, Part 117, sanitation controls are one of the preventive controls that the written food safety plan has to envelope. And the effectiveness of preventive controls as verification of adequacy of those preventive controls is specifically what we're talking about. And so sanitation controls for the cleanliness of food contact surfaces is a preventive control, and the monitoring and verification must specifically address those preventive controls. And validation of environmental pathogen monitoring is not a requirement as part of the regulatory rule. So when Food and Drug issued the final rule and also the draft rule, what they had to do was define an environmental pathogen, which might seem kind of simple, but it's a little harder than it sounds because, of course, an environmental pathogen can vary depending on the operation. What they called it in the rule is an environmental pathogen is an organism that's of public health significance and is capable of surviving and persisting within manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding environment. And the examples they cited in the rule were Salmonella and Listeria monocytogenes. And so what they said was that in the preventive controls plan, hazard identification and evaluation for the environment, and in order to identify environmental pathogens that are known or reasonably foreseeable hazard to the food need to be identified. And they also, what they're saying is that an evaluation as to whether contamination of ready-to-eat food is reasonably likely to occur is required. And so elements of the rule are that monitoring and verification is necessary for pathogens, relevant pathogens, and again, that environmental program serves as verification of effectiveness. So when we talk about whether the hazard is reasonably likely to occur, that involves risk assessment and consideration of outbreaks of illness in the past, recall events, reportable foods registry events, what environmental pathogen survey findings have happened in the past, and the opportunity for exposure to the food of pathogens from handling, sanitation, equipment, or environment. And so when you consider all of those potential routes of entry in your risk assessment, there are very few foods that would not be included in the requirement. And so foods that have post-lethality exposure to the environment, which are ready to eat, are among those that the requirement applies. And so again, the Food and Drug just last month, no, around January 15th, issued a draft guidance for the control of Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat foods. And in that, they, for the first time, issued environmental monitoring criteria in that draft document relative to Listeria only. And so those of us who are in the low moisture foods category and not the refrigerated category might be looking at that and thinking, well, that applies to Listeria, but what about Salmonella, which would be my more important food safety risk? And the answer to that really is we have to look back at the definition of an environmental pathogen. And I think what we know right now is that Food and Drugs thinking is that both Salmonella and Listeria are considered pathogens with potential for growth, survival, occurrence in the food environment. And so both organisms might be included in a low moisture food, whereas in a high moisture food, Listeria might be the only organism of concern. So I would encourage everybody to pull out that draft guidance that was issued and take a look at it. It's out for comment right now, and it could change, but it's very enlightening. And much of what we're going to go over today is highlighted in that document, and there's a lot more information in it, so I would strongly recommend reading it. Okay, in that document, what it says is that environmental monitoring must be effective to determine if Listeria control measures are adequate. And again, that can include sponge sampling, air sampling, water, food residues, or basically anything else. Of course, the importance of this as the first mandatory environmental pathogen monitoring is that there are implications potential for the food itself relative to environmental sampling, particularly if we're talking about food contact surfaces. And of course, the regulatory zero tolerance rule for absence of pathogens in ready-to-eat foods applies. And so if we're evaluating surfaces, food contact surfaces in the ready-to-eat environment, and we find a pathogen on those, then the food is directly implicated, meaning it's considered adulterated unless it's processed with a validated lethal process to eliminate that pathogen. And so that's why there's so much concern and care that needs to be taken here, and it's tricky. So detection of, again, we said detection of pathogen on ready-to-eat food contact implicates the food. Detection of a pathogen indicator, so not a direct pathogen, but an indicator, which we'll talk about, on a ready-to-eat food contact surface may or may not implicate the food, and that needs consideration in the plan as well. We need to make sure food is controlled appropriately when zone 1 or food itself is sampled, so that we don't have a potential for a recall on our hands. And so what FDA requires is that there be written monitoring procedures for environmental pathogens. And in those written procedures that each one of us is going to need to have, we need to talk about the environmental pathogen monitoring program and the fact that it's developed on a risk basis, and it needs to be scientifically valid, thought out with a lot of the considerations we're going to talk about today. We need to talk about test organism selection, when and where pathogen indicators are used, such as Listeria genus as an indicator for pathogen itself, and specific testing for Listeria monocytogenes. The written program needs to talk about sampling locations, number of sampling sites. It needs to have a master swab site that supports the program, where the sites are fully described, and they should be permanently coded relative to what sanitary zone they're in, whether they're in food contact or non-food contact. And the definition of the zones, as FDA has drafted them in the draft guidance, need to be looked at, because as an industry, we see USDA definitions, we see industry association definitions, and we see all kinds of definitions. This is the one we need to make sure we lock in on for regulatory purposes. And so zone 1 is in food and drugs eyes are food contact surfaces. So those are going to be utensils, tables, slicers, surfaces that the food itself, food or packaging directly contacts. Zone 2, in their eyes, is going to be non-food contact surfaces that are adjacent or in close proximity to food or food contact surfaces. So that might be outer housings of equipment, equipment frames, things like that that don't directly touch the food. And zone 3 are a little bit more remote from adjacent surfaces to zone 1. They're in the exposed product processing room and where exposed food is handled, but they're not adjacent to food contact surfaces. And then in FDA's eyes, zone 4 are non-food contact surfaces that are remote areas outside the processing area. And so that includes common areas, lunchrooms, locker rooms, warehouses where product is not exposed, food or packaging is not exposed, and things of that nature. And so understanding where those zones are in proximity to exposed food, we know that zone 1 is where exposed food and packaging contacts that surface. And then everything radiates out, and the higher the zone number, the further radiating from the food or food contact surfaces itself. So let's talk about master swab site list as a part of our written pathogen monitoring plan. It is important to make a separate list or separately define zone 1 surfaces, zone 2 surfaces, zone 3 surfaces, and zone 4 surfaces because of their proximity to food contact surfaces and relative to one another, what our findings are. And when the agency asks us for our swab site lists and they look at our findings in the future, which are in their purview, when we're under FSMA rule, these findings are in their purview, and they need to be able to discriminate from your plan what surfaces are zone 1 versus zone 2 versus zone 3, for example, because their interpretation of how important those are depends on that. So creating permanent codes for each site, swab site or sampling site, is really important for tracking and trending purposes. So for example, a manufacturer often codifies a sample site as Z1.23, and that's always and forever going to be a zone 1 surface, and it's sample number 23 of the food contact surfaces is always going to be the discharge surface from the dicer, for example. And if you get rid of that dicer, you retire that number. If you replace that dicer, the same number gets assigned to it, and if you add another dicer, it might be relative to dicers. So it still be Z1.23, and it's going to be maybe composite of dicers. So describing the surface narratively, so only calling it discharge from the dicer, doesn't help promote or permit good tracking and trending and mapping. And what's such big focus in the FSMA rule is persistence of pathogens. And so not only where they occur and when they occur, but it's when they recur and how often they recur and at what rate, at what sites, that might indicate that there's a harborage condition or something that's going to cause contamination to hang somewhere. And so it's really important for us to understand very clearly
All right. Are you there, Melissa? I think the sound cut out on your end. Okay. Well, what we can do here is just hold on 1 second. I apologize, everybody. We'll get this resolved. Please hold on. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for being patient. Melissa just had some minor technical difficulties. She's resolving and she'll be back on in a minute. But I'm going to just keep on moving with this just so we don't lose any time, and just sort of pick up where she left off, and then she'll be right back. So basically, if it's not written down, it never happened, right? If it's not written down, it never happened. And so making sure that we do everything that we can to document our swabbing, that we did it, where we did it, how we did it, what we're looking for, is going to help. And the same thing applies when we're going through, say, a recall situation. We need to destroy product. We also want to take photos of that and keep all the information that we can. So we're doing the same kind of diligence that we would here with our master swab list. Oh, sorry, I apologize. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, I thought that was one of you calling me because you had a question about getting on. Okay, so there is a requirement when you are looking for Listeria. Keep in mind with the preventive controls for human food rule, the requirement is that you is that if you have ready-to-eat food that is exposed to the environment, prior to packaging. So, for example, if you're making cheese and you pasteurize it and then it's exposed to the environment before you put it in its packaging, you are required to do what you can to prevent, eliminate, reduce the chance of contamination from an environmental hazard. This draft guidance that Melissa is leading you through is very useful in that it's for Listeria, which is the environmental pathogen for particularly wet processors, but the preventive controls for human food rule requirement is not limited to the Listeria. It could also be Salmonella. It could be any other kind of environmental pathogen. But either way, referring to the FDA guidance on Listeria is really going to help you out in having a methodical way with dealing with environmental pathogens. So when we're talking about the number of routine samples that you have, as you can see on the slide, each food contact surface, that is in a post-lethality step, so that could be after you pasteurize. If it's exposed to the environment and it's ready to eat, we'll need to swab every month if that food is capable of supporting Listeria monocytogenes. And if you're unsure if your food supports Listeria monocytogenes, you can actually find in the appendices in your FSPCA manual if you have one, or you can go to the Fish and Fishery HACCP guidance, and in their appendices they also have growth conditions for Listeria. So there are lots of resources you could also find online. So Zone 1 and Zone 2 surfaces are going to have a higher number of swabs. Smallest processors have a minimum of 5 food contact surfaces, 5 non-food contact surfaces on each production line. And you know, that sounds very minimal, but that cost can really go up over time, because if you have a presumptive positive, and each swab can be up to $30 a swab. So when you're developing this program, you really want to be thinking about your budget and what you can afford, but at least seeing that 5 food contact surfaces, 5 non-food contact surfaces should provide you with the baseline. Food contact surfaces, FDA says, should not be composited. And so for those of you who are relatively new to environmental monitoring, composite swabs are when you take one swab and swab multiple surfaces and then send that sample. And that is a very cost-effective way of doing environmental monitoring. And ideally, if they're all negative, that's a really great sign. But if you get a positive, now you have 5 surfaces and you're not sure which one it came from. So there are ups and downs doing that. So at minimum, if you are sampling during production, 3 to 4 hours into production. So, oh, I can see Melissa is sort of moving around on the slide.
Yeah. Technical difficulties. Thank you for taking over, Charlie. All of a sudden, everything just went out.
All right, please take it away.
All right, great. So timing and frequency of sampling in the draft guidance, what Food and Drug said was that samples inclusive of food contact surfaces, when those are sampled, should be sampled operationally, minimum 3 to 4 hours into production, or they said ideally post-operational, which all of us are probably have alarm bells going off in our heads thinking about, okay, how do we control product that we manufactured all day or over a 3 to 4 hour period? And of course the trick is keeping control of those until we understand what the results are, so we don't put ourselves in a potential issue with recall. Sampling intervals that they suggest in the guidance are that all sites must be tested over a defined period of time relative to risk. And that's why it's so important to fully develop our swab site list, so that we have our routine surveillance sites that we monitor, independent of those that are special sites, that are vector sites, that are investigational sites, because those are not all those need to be sampled over that defined period of time. It's just our program sites. So what they said was that for foods that do not support the growth of LM, that the lowest sampling frequency is monthly. So if you think back to the very smallest firms that Charlie was talking about, where FDA said the very smallest firm ever would do a minimum of 5 food contact surface and 5 non-food contact surface each time they sample. And so if your food doesn't support the growth of LM, if you're a dry product or a high acid product or whatever, your lowest minimum sampling frequency is going to be monthly. When or if your product or components can support the growth of Listeria monocytogenes, what they in their guidance say is that all zone 1 sites must be represented at least monthly, and that sampling must be done at the highest frequency because there's highest risk because the food supports the growth of Listeria, and that representation of zones 1 and 2 should be highest. And what they say is that both zone 1 and 2 should be sampled at the same time. So that's what they recommend in the guidance. What they say for a food that supports the growth of Listeria is that every 2 weeks, zone 3 swabbing needs to be performed. And what they say is that zone 4 has to be performed every month. There has to be zone 4 sites sampled. They say that all non-food contact surfaces, inclusive of zones 2 through 4, need to be represented at least quarterly. So what that implies is that they're thinking that rotation of sample sites would be utilized, but remember that minimum for 5 swabs per line for the very smallest facility. So what that means is that zones 1 and 2 really would be those numbers of samples, either weekly or monthly, depending on whether they support the growth or not of Listeria, and that's how that goes. The tests need to be conducted with a scientifically valid method, one that's AOAC approved, for example. It's an enrichment method that detects presence or absence of the pathogen or pathogen indicator. They talk a little about laboratory credentials, and they brought up ISO 17025 accreditation, which is consistent with what their recommendations were for laboratories to support the supplier verification and foreign supplier verification. They require written procedures. In the written procedures, we have to have the test methodology, laboratory identified, laboratory credentials, corrective action procedures for any environmental findings that are non-food contact, and also findings for food contact surfaces. Specifically, what it is that we're going to do to remedy a nonconformance is required. And in the written procedures, we also need to have corrective actions, and specifically to ensure the cause of contamination has been identified and corrected, that their potential for food contamination has been minimized, that the corrective actions are relative to environmental monitoring strategy for the food and risk of the food is what they mean. And the corrective action procedures depend on whether the finding is food contact or non-food contact. And of course, we do different things, more aggressive if they're food contact. They also want us to consider in the corrective action procedures whether the finding was a single nonconformance or whether there are multiples. The proximity of the finding to relative to food contact surface and the food. They want us to talk about intensified cleaning, vector sampling, and make decisions about whether food testing is warranted. What they want us to do is have written verification of monitoring procedures. And they recommend that periodic intensified sampling be done, and especially if you move along in your program and you don't ever find any positives, they recommend reassessment and deeper sampling to figure out if the sampling method or frequency or stringency is just not good enough, or maybe you're just excellent with your control measures, but either way, looking at it. They want you to have some frequency or plan for sampling and testing ready-to-eat foods, and also to have specific written corrective action for detection in the foods if that pathogen detection in the foods were to happen as a result of sampling it. Records, requirements, again, FDA is going to review the results. That's now in their purview, and they're also going to review corrective actions and those records, related records. And if they disagree with our, judgment as far as what if a surface or condition is adequately remedied, that disagreement could lead to some issues with the agency. So it's really important to have those defined ahead of time. And they recommend analysis of data for trends relative to the environment and relative to the food product, so that we're not only responding to individual test results, but we're responding to clusters of results or patterns of results that might indicate there's an issue that we might have missed with an individual test result. And so the pathogen monitoring has to be effective for its intended purpose. It has to be robust enough to provide good confidence that we've got control of the environment. It's got to involve effective, indicator testing or sentry elements, that signal us that we've got to do something, that something might be amiss. And of course, it's got to be reasonable enough that operation program is not too cost prohibitive, because if it is, it wouldn't be sustainable, and that would be a problem in and of itself. So we really need to adopt a seek and destroy approach for our environmental pathogen monitoring, and those of us on the phone probably already do. But in a very decided way, we have to make sure that we've got a really strong backbone with our sanitation controls and our routine sampling and what we do for our vector sampling, that we have effective and progressive corrective actions related to findings, and that we've got good trend evaluation, the ability to observe trends, whether it's keeping a hit map or tracking or trending. What kind of feedback do we have that systems are in control? So strategy. Strategy is everything, and there's many times when I have walked into a firm where the agency is sampling large numbers of samples in their process environment, and the agency finds a lot of positives, or more positives than you typically find, because they're sampling more than you typically sample. And so a strategic change in how we collect the samples is really necessary, so that we don't have to take gobs and gobs of samples to be able to predict what FDA would find if they sampled, and so that we could have confidence that lower numbers of samples would indicate the hygiene of the environment, the hygienic condition. So that strategy is really the sampling of wide composite surface areas in non-food contact zones for routine surveillance purposes. So representative of larger surfaces makes the sampling more sensitive and likely to detect the target that we're looking for, which is a pathogen or pathogen indicator. That type of approach is more cost effective because it results in fewer tests, and usage of pathogen indicators or genus tests become applied. We don't do compositing for zone 1. We do compositing as necessary, or big wide samples for zones 2, 3, and 4. And what we make sure we do is don't cross the zones. We don't take a swab where we represented zone 2 surfaces and move into zone 1 or move into zone 3. So we always keep the swab a wide composite, but relative to itself. And so, sampling of specific surfaces within a larger object or area constitutes vector sampling, and that is much smaller, more specific surface area that's really specifically used to determine source of contamination if contamination is there. It's less cost effective because it results in more tests, but it's more specific because the surfaces that become evaluated we can get specific information on location of contamination. So, and pathogen indicator or specific pathogens can be tested depending on the plan. So in vector sampling, specific surface areas within the wide composite area are collected after a wide composite, wide surface area finding. So we do fewer samples but bigger, wider surface areas, and we reserve our vector sampling for circumstances when we've had a wide, inclusive composite sample come up non-conforming. And that way, resources get better utilized and everything else. So we, of course, want to select surfaces for vector sampling, surfaces with visual evidence of potential issue, most difficult to clean, have had a history, we profiled them and we know they're problematic, or maybe we're disassembling equipment to try and investigate. We often, when we're vector sampling, select nearby surfaces from other zones if that's warranted. And when we have a finding for a zone 2 or zone 3 in exposed product production areas, we often collect a zone 1 surface to provide information that zone 1 hasn't been affected by the finding. So in this example here, we've got a production area, and this is ready to eat, post disinfection on a produce. And if we decide that we're going to take we decided that Z2.15 is our permanent sample number, and it equates the underside framework and footing of the transfer from the flume and flighted conveyor to the spinner. So it's really this surface here. It's really zone 2 is adjacent, underside frame footing, right? So it's going to be a wide composite of all this and all this under here and under here, but not food contact surfaces themselves. We're staying away from food contact and we're sampling a big wide sample of adjacent. So if there's anything that is happening on these motors, motor cabinets, frames, footings, if there's anything happening there, the Listeria genus swab will trigger off, it'll sound off. And so our big wide surveillance sample it covers multiple equipment that's intimate to one another across zone 2. If we look at that and we say, hey, if we got a positive on that, we may actually go back and vector. We're going to do Z2.15.V1, vector 1 is going to be the motor on the transfer from the flume to the flighted conveyor. So my vector sample is going to be this. And then I'm going to do another vector sample of these footings underneath this incline transfer from the flume. And then I'm going to do a separate vector of these footings here at floor level nearby the drain down here. And I may get this bearings at the ends of these rollers as a zone 2. And I might do those each individually, right, on a vector and name them a permanent vector site and do them separately if I had an issue with this one. And so that very same concept can be used to minimize the number of swabs that we do while making sure that our coverage is proper and effective. And so we could do the same thing with a zone 3. We're looking, that was a zone 2. If we looked at zone 3, it's hard to see here, but there's a big floor drain here underneath that passes underneath the equipment. And so if this room has a floor drain that runs this way, I'm going to swab and composite. There's a floor drain back there. There's probably the floor drain back there. And even in that same room, I'm going to do my routine wide zone 3 swabbing if there's a drain line over here somewhere. I'm going to swab beginning and end of each of those drain line and composite them for my wide surveillance. And then if I get a positive on my composite, I'm going to go back and vector sample this end of the drain, this end of the floor drain, over here this end, maybe the middle underneath the flume. So I'm going to vector and do a lot more individuals if I get a positive here on the big composite, but otherwise I'm just going to do my big wide composite. And so that's a good example of vectoring for zone 2, vectoring for zone 3. And remember we said we don't really vector for zone 1. Zone 1, let's do this. Zone 1 here, we may take as close to the end of the incline conveyor as possible, because that's going to represent the surfaces before it along these two pieces of equipment. So I might take this as discharge into the slicer. I might take, or into the packaging unit. I might do a zone 1 here. I'm going to have zone 1s back at possibly the discharge of the flume, and then probably zone 1 here where the product rolls into here. So I'm going to have some zone 1 surfaces on this line, and again, I won't really composite those. I may rotate them line to line, but I'm not going to composite those surfaces, if that makes sense. And so if we, for example, move to another system here, we know that our zone 1, the product's moving this direction, and so zone 1 would be inclusive of everything prior to this, and so it's at the discharge here where product runs off the end there and into bins. Overhead surfaces where we might have drippage and drainage onto the product, these would all be zone 1 surfaces. But when I swab zone 1, I'm really going to swab the end of this piece of equipment, because when I do it operationally, everything upstream of it is probably going to evidence itself here at the end of the process. So the only reason I might vector over here, or vector up here, or vector on any of these spray bars overhead, or whatever, is because I get a positive here that's unexpected. And so if we looked at the end of, this is the other end of the piece of equipment. So here was our zone 1 at the end here, and what it does is drop into bins. If my zone 2 surfaces that I might pick for this piece of equipment is going to be a very large wide composite of these underside frame footing of the entirety of this whole flume system, right? I can't take anything, these are not zone 2, because they drip and drain right directly into the fluid vessel here. So this is a zone 1 effectively, not a zone 2. So I am going to be really careful about not commingling those. And so I would change them up a bit, right? Okay, so I think everybody gets the idea that anything that could drip, drain, drawn, or directly contaminate food or food contact surfaces is really going to be part of that zone 1. These are very, very tough surfaces up here. This motor up here is a tough surface because it's really not intended as a food contact surface, but it's located right above. And so we've got to have adequate cleaning methodologies, and so that we don't have fluid and contaminants drop and drain out of this into the product stream. So this piece of equipment by design is pretty challenging. So I think, again, we would come back here and look at zone 3 would be the floors and floor drains. Wherever they occur, they might be walls, they might be other surfaces inside the room here. If we look at this and try to pick off zone 1 surfaces in this room, well, his hands are a zone 1. The bucket itself is a zone 1 because food's contained in it directly that won't be cooked. Actually, the bucket gets inverted over the product stream in these bins here, so the inside of these bins is zone 1. That, since the bins get inverted from these plastic pallets here, that makes these plastic pallets really effectively zone 1 surfaces because the containers touch them. And so then we would go back and look at zone 2 in here. Effectively, zone 2 might be the underside of this pallet. Zone 2 is going to be the underside frame, footings of all these bins in this room, other equipment, and whatnot. And then zone 3 is going to be floor drains, it's going to be floors, it's going to be things like that. And so I'm not sure if it's helpful to go through examples like this because I know a lot of you already have, most of you already have your own programs, but I think sometimes to look at it maybe something different or through a different lens might be valuable. And so here we've got exposed product in cheese vats. We've got surfaces here that run above the cheese vat. And so effectively these could drip, drain, or have contaminant drawn right into the product stream. So that makes these really zone 1 surfaces. And then zone 2 is really going to be underside frame, footings of all these vats, which underside frame footing of carts or pumps that roll up to the line that pump product out, and those types of things. And we'd have a whole set of other equipment that we would process the cheese on. And so same concept here in a dry process. We've got zone 1 surfaces here and zone 1 surfaces here. And then zone 2 is really the sum of underside frame footings and adjacent to zone 1. Even these overhead surfaces above exposed product here at either inlet or exhaust from the dryer are really zone 1 surfaces because contaminant could drip, drain, or be drawn from them. And so we already talked about vectoring, and we want to make sure that we identify vector sites within the site as a subordinate to the site they tie with, and that's a good idea for being able to associate them with one another from time to time. If we look at common pitfalls and disasters and what goes wrong with programs and causes regulators to find positives when we don't find them ourselves, what happens is if we take too many small surfaces, so we take too many small areas and we rotate them, and the agency comes in and takes 150 samples, small samples, they're more, by probability's sake, they're more likely to find a positive. And so for us, we've got to take that bigger, wider vector approach, or excuse me, bigger, wider composite approach rather than a small vector approach. So what that happens is surfaces don't become sampled often enough if we sample too small of sites, and there's not enough surface area representation for adequate sensitivity of the testing. And so the sum of that can make the agency more likely to find a positive than we do. The other factor is sometimes we can't sample zone 1 surfaces if we haven't arranged our processes so that we can keep control of the finished product, or the shelf life permits that. And so if we haven't swabbed zone 1 surfaces and the agency can walk up and swab those, it makes them more likely to find a positive than we can without that ability. And sometimes one of the key causes is that we're collecting our samples pre-operational for example, and the agency generally collects their samples operationally. So materials are in motion, people are in motion, whatever's there has moved and spread, and so spread factor, very, very important. And so their ability to find a positive can be higher than us if we're taking pre-ops. There are various indicators we can use. There's the pathogen itself, Salmonella. There are pathogen indicators for Salmonella, like an HTEB group. Listeria Monocytogenes is pathogen. The agencies call Listeria genus pathogen indicator. If we're taking aerobic plate counts or coliforms or ATPs, those are good soils indicators and good indicators of hygiene, but they're not considered pathogen indicators, and so they really won't necessarily satisfy the agency's requirement for pathogen or pathogen indicator monitoring. So our indicator strategy, we want to make sure that we have, that we're collecting, that we're responding to positives for indicators as stringently and vigorously as if they involved a positive pathogen. We want to look at collections of data and sums of data and look for spikes in the results, clusters, other changes, seasonal relationship. If there's events like construction or sewer backup, there are, FDA again looks at persistence of pathogens, automated software for bacterial pathogen mapping, tracking, trending, like ebacmap.com, gives you maps, gives you incidence reporting, and then gives you corrective action commentary that's available when the FDA demands it, when they're verifying your conformance to the rule. So again, typical environmental pathogen program failures involve poor method selection. If there's not an enrichment step, sometimes if in the method, so method selection, super important. Making sure that representation of surfaces is nice and wide, and so that we can have appropriate stringency and know if something's going on and respond to it. Sometimes there's a lot of swabbing being done and a lot of sampling being done, but they're wrong sites or they're too small of sites, and so we can't represent everything without wide samples, and we don't know something is going on, which can cause a failure. If we look at data trending, escalation of corrective actions, if we've got multiple positive results that occur over time that mean that there's some sort of special or deeper corrective action that's necessary, that's often a program failure issue. The things I would leave you with and suggest is, I would again suggest reading the Listeria draft guidance. Go to work defining your environmental pathogens relative to your operation, and you can see on the premise on what FDA has said is that really, regardless of what type of food, it would be Listeria, and if it's a low moisture food, it's going to be Salmonella as well. You want to create written monitoring and corrective action plans. You want to make sure you operate your written plan in conformance to it, and make sure that you look at the sums of data and trend information. And what they say in their document is to make sure that you reassess routinely to verify adequacy of the program. And with that, I thank you and invite anybody for questions. I realize we're a little bit over here. I intended to be finished 10 minutes ago. My apologies, Charlie. I'll turn it back to you.
No problem at all. Thank you so much, Melissa. And you know, this is, I feel like this is good safety that people actually want more of rather than less of. So more is better. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to, in our chat, if you don't mind displaying your name in the chat, feel free to ask questions. And we're getting one that's asking, what was the suggestion regarding post-operational testing?
Well, the FDA suggested ideally that all environmental pathogen swabbing be done after production for the day before cleaning, so that your pathogen monitoring is inclusive of everything that could have happened for the day and movement of contamination if it was there. That was the foundation of that comment.
Mm-hmm. And thanks for the answer. I just want to interject my own question there. I know that FDA announced that they're changing their policy on testing Listeria species as opposed to Listeria monocytogenes. Are you aware of the changes, and maybe a short update on what that is?
Well, yeah, that's when we talked about pathogens or pathogen indicators. FDA permits you, a pathogen indicator is Listeria genus, and Listeria monocytogenes is the pathogen. And so they didn't come out and say that you have to test for pathogens per se, so Listeria monocytogenes. You could use Listeria genus as your pathogen indicator, but when you have findings that suggest that where you have findings where zone 1 is contaminated, for example, you've got that with pathogen indicator. What you have to do is either test the food for absence of Listeria monocytogenes or test that surface for absence, confirm that testing on that surface for pathogen indicator to verify whether Listeria monocytogenes is absent. And so they sort of relaxed, in that regard, they relaxed the requirements, but they sort of didn't relax them in the regard that, if you've got any kind of pattern of findings of pathogen indicators on food contact surfaces, and then later on you start testing or investigating and you find pathogens, your prior findings with indicators might in fact call into question whether that product processed around that time was affected with pathogens. And so it's very important in our programs to make sure that we have the testing of the food for Listeria integrated into the plan to correct or to address that, and that when we find positives for pathogen indicators on food contact surfaces, that we specifically either test the food itself, the output food, for absence of pathogen, or that we test the food contact surface for absence of the pathogen. So there's a lot. I would strongly suggest reading the guidance for that reason, and caution everybody that when the Food and Drug actually has written in, just like USDA did for ready-to-eat meat and poultry and their Listeria rule, Food and Drug actually wrote in some corrective action suggestions for the number of Listeria genus findings on food contact before you would need to hold and test the food. But the caution is that sometimes, even once when you've got a Listeria genus positive on food contact surface, if you've got an issue and that's the front end of the issue as you recognized it, it could be that when you go forward in time and you learn of something that's gone on, it could actually, your food that's already been released could have potentially been implicated. So right. Caution in design of your programs in that regard.
Got it. Okay. We just got actually a little flurry of questions. Let's see. So I'm just going up to the top, and let's see. What pathogens might we, as an ingredient processor, might be looking for? That's kind of a case specific. So I'll let you guys talk about that one offline. But moving on to the next one, this may be obvious, but will HTE? Well, actually, before I even ask that, somebody asked what HTEB stands for.
Oh, HTEB. I'm sorry, I had to cut some things out for time's sake, so my apologies to all. HTEB is a specific subgroup of Enterobacteriaceae that are indicators, an indicator group for Salmonella. So in a dry plant process, an HTEB evaluation is something that's good to design into the program.
All right, great. So that leads right into the next question, which was, this may be obvious, but will HTEB and Listeria species suffice for zone 1, et cetera, at the appropriate intervals? My guess is that that's going to be case specific. What's your answer, Melissa?
Well, yes, as long as they're negative, but when they're positive, that's when you've got to look at what measures you've taken for evaluation of the further evaluation of the food for the pathogen itself. Your indicator, your strategy may be look for the indicators, react to the indicators, and be very aggressive. But when we do get pathogen indicators on food contact surfaces, that's when we've got to either evaluate the surface and confirm it for the pathogen, or test for absence of the pathogen in the food.
Okay, so why then would you, well, I guess the reason's clear why you would still test for HTEB Listeria species over actually searching for the pathogen on the zone 1.
Right, because those are wider groups than the pathogen themselves, and so you're going to see sort of a leading edge. You're going to see hits on those before you see there are more genera that will trigger a positive reaction on the indicators, and so the idea is you'll be ahead of anything that is a pathogen if you've responded to a wider indicator.
Okay, great. And I think you answered the last question by that same person about would a zone 1 HTEB positive count as a pathogen indicator that would result in either finished product testing or zone 1 testing. And it seems that you already answered that if you get a positive from an indicator, the next step is to look for the pathogen or
Yes, and that's why I'm saying read that guidance, because in the guidance they don't necessarily say that the first pathogen indicator that you see a positive on a food contact surface requires finished product testing. But when you look at future findings and a potential issue that might be happening that you haven't yet become fully aware of, could mean that without that verification of absence of pathogen from the prior findings, could mean that product you've prior released might be at risk of recall if there was something that you found later on going forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah. We have another question, actually a very good one. I feel like a lot of people ask this, is our environmental results take 5 days to come back to us. So do we not do any production until then? Is there any way around this? How do other companies work this out?
My suggestion would be 2 things. You always want to hold on to product while food contact surfaces or the food itself or ingredients and ready to eat that don't have a kill stuff, but you always want to hold product where pathogen testing on any of those is happening. But there are some extremely good 24 and 26-hour screen methodologies for pathogens or pathogen indicators that are extremely good. And my suggestion would be to look at those. You can talk to the FML team, any of them, and they can talk to you about options on methodologies.
The FML team being your team at Food Microlabs?
Yeah, Food Microlabs, any of them would be so happy. I would be happy. Any of our food safety solutions folks would be happy to answer questions on that. And method selection, so as long as the method is valid and appropriate for sensitivity for presence-absence result, that methodology should be very appropriate, and there are some really good, faster methodologies out there now. Cultural methodologies that are in like the FDA Bacteriological Analytical Manual, Those are excellent benchmark methods, but those are what we call cultural methods, and the time it takes to run those analyses is much longer. And so the technologies that we have that are the phage assays, fluorescent antibody, polymerase chain, molecular assays, those type of things are the things where the methodologies where we've got the technology to detect the target at lower concentrations, meaning so incubation time can be quite a bit shorter than a cultural method that may take 4 days. We can get a screen on a fluorescent antibody or a phage assay in 24, 26 hours. So there's some options out there now for pathogen indicators.
Okay, great. So I think we'll take one more question, and that is, can you explain what an enrichment step is when swabbing?
An enrichment step. So an enrichment step is the step in the analytical laboratory where you take the sponge swab or the scraping or whatever the sample material is, and what you do is introduce that sample into pre-enrichment broth or basically a culture media that's intended to grow and amplify the target organism you're looking for, and that is what helps grow it and amplify it, and that's what it is necessary for it to be detected when it was present in very, very low levels to begin with. It's an amplification step.
Great.
So
Great.
there are test kit companies out there that you'll find to steer away from that say, yeah, you can get a result for Listeria in 2 hours or 3 hours tops. And those are the methods to steer away from, because what they don't have is an enrichment step where they amplify the target organism where it grows up so that it's detectable. And so what happens is when you test without enrichment, the cell numbers have to be extremely high in order for you to detect anything. So false negative results or thinking the sample was negative when it actually was positive and a problem is the issue with that type of methodology.
And I'm sure many people are thinking, should I be concerned about enriching a pathogen inside my plant? To those people, what is your answer normally?
Yeah, that is a pretty big problem, and that's why, you know, the Listeria is a biosafety, a Centers for Disease Control. It's a biosafety level 2 organism. It's an organism that can, you know, kill the fetus of a pregnant person who's working in the laboratory if she were to become infected or contaminated. So people that are working with these organisms and these tests need to be specially trained, and those types of control measures need to exist in the laboratory for safety of the workers who are working in the laboratory. And then there's a whole other set of safety parameters that apply to preventing cross-contamination of the facility, the building, the food processing facility itself, and cross-contamination there, which can, of course, cause contamination of the food that's being manufactured. So when you, in the laboratory, when you have an amplification step, so a step of the process that's intended to grow up to very high levels, the target you're looking for, people who are working in the facility, the laboratory, are handling amplified, highly contaminated, potentially highly contaminated cultures, and that which with high potential for cross-contamination of the process environment. So really, really special control measures like separate facility entrances and prohibiting supplies from going from the laboratory into the food plant, separate walkway, pathways, entranceways.
So the real issue if you don't already have an internal laboratory and all those controls in place.
Yeah, for pathogens, yeah, Salmonella and Listeria pathogens, E. coli 157, they're very, the control measures for protection of the food plant itself and then for workers are a lot more heavy than doing a test that's commonly done in-house, like an aerobic plate count, a coliform, a yeast and mold, indicator tests that don't amplify pathogen bacteria.
Got it. Well, great. Well, thank you again, Melissa. And I just want to close out this webinar with just a couple quick slides. And we got a lot of really wonderful information about Listeria, which is the environmental pathogen of concern for so many of us, and about FSMA. And I just wanted to add that if your environmental pathogen is Salmonella or something else, we'll be sending you guys also these slides where we just summarize from the rule the requirement that we have wherever we've identified a preventive control, we have to verify it, and if we have a ready-to-eat food, we're going to need to right here it says environmental monitoring for an environmental pathogen or an indicator organism if appropriate. If contamination of a ready-to-eat food with an environmental pathogen is a hazard requiring preventive control by collecting and testing environmental samples. So environmental monitoring, in short, is considered a verification method for making sure that if we have a preventive control for preventing cross-contamination of ready-to-eat food before packaging, we can rely on environmental monitoring as a verification method. That's kind of a lot at once. And then here are the requirements. But I put down the code right here so you can actually go see it for yourself. And this matches up very well with what we were talking about today for Listeria. So that is it. We've gone 20 minutes over, and I just want to thank Melissa again for speaking to us and helping make this free and available to everybody. Please help us spread the word about these webinars. We'll be holding them on the first of every month, the first business day of every month. And this is a special invitation to all of you, but for future webinars, we're going to be making them open to the public. So please feel free to spread the word. And we're going to be doing this all the way until September, when the compliance deadline for small businesses goes into effect for the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. So thanks again. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week. We'll see you around campus.
Thank you.